extraordinary influence. I would say really the catalyst for this entire project was our initial conversation with Professor Harris on the day that Cambridge went into lockdown. In the PDF, it looks like we're on page 22, which is odd to me, but that's where we are. And in the book, if you have the hard copy, we're starting at page 39, and I'll just open it up with "On the History of School Desegregation Efforts in Boston," David J. Harris. And David, I'll just read his intro, Sabelo, and then you can take over. And David, everyone, a number of people in our book are actually have actually moved on from these positions. So I'll just continue to read from what was happening at the time. David J. Harris was the managing director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. He previously served as founding executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston. He has served on many boards, including Mass Humanities as president 2006 to 2008, and is currently the chair of the Massachusetts Advisory Committee and the U.S. Commission to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Harris provides an overview of the history of school desegregation efforts in Boston and shows how racial inequities were maintained through housing policies. He also warns of the dangers of allowing systemic inequalities to shape narratives around Black communities. Sabelo?
Brown versus Board of Education judged that the education system we had was illegal and unconstitutional, but didn't necessarily require action. Brown too effectively said, we have to dismantle it with all deliberate speed, which we have come to know left an unbelievable amount of flexibility for people to determine what's deliberate and what's speed. All over the country, things proceeded slowly.
Can you keep going for another paragraph?
Sure. But it's also true that in some places, states and jurisdictions did take it seriously, at least on a rhetorical level. In Boston, the Racial Imbalance Act, which passed in 1965, sought to finally make Brown's mandate real and eliminate the racial imbalance that characterized our schools. As people started to organize and mobilize, and then litigate the failure to eliminate the imbalances, it became a catalyst for activism.
Elise Hestack.
All right, I'm reading on the screen. Okay. Morgan versus Hennigan, 1974, was the result of considerable activism with Ruth Batson and others central to this effort, which traces back to the 1850 court case, Roberts versus the City of Boston. More than 100 years before Morgan versus Hennigan, a Black father tried to enroll his 5-year-old daughter in a school that was closer by and that he thought would give her a better education. Although he lost that case, Massachusetts banned segregated schools in 1955. So even before Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, before Brown versus Board of Education, segregated schools were illegal in the state of Massachusetts. It's an important thing for us to raise because we too often forget just how long and how deep the struggle has been, and that Black people throughout history have sought their rights and recognized the structure of inequality. Can you imagine having a 5-year-old daughter and seeing what is being withheld from her because of her race? Part of the legacy of Morgan versus Hannigan is the mechanisms of hatred that arose in response to school segregation in Boston, one of which was the South Boston Betterment Trust. To me, it was similar to the White Citizens Council of the South. These were holders and protectors of white privilege and white power, even as the formal battle over integration of the Boston public schools started to die off. The South Boston Betterment Trust endured, and its poisons continue to. I have to wait until the screen switches. Continued to spread to public housing through the development of tenant councils and public housing developments. These organizations were dominated by people from the South Boston Betterment Trust.
Georgette has stack.
Okay. This received knowledge that if we had desegregated housing first, we might have avoided some of the violence and the vitriol that accompanied desegregating schools. I personally wonder about that, but one thing it would have done is diminish the need to use transportation to achieve the ends of integration. If residential segregation had been dismantled first, busing wouldn't have been necessary. In Boston, residential segregation was maintained by state action. Public housing was segregated along neighborhood lines. Most neighborhoods in Boston had public housing developments, and that development was populated by the dominant racial group of that neighborhood. What happened was that each development had separate waiting lists. So the South Boston development would have a waiting list made up of entirely of white people. Some of the same activities, activists who fought school segregation had to fight the discriminatory practices, public housing, and had to get the courts to aggressively order the creation of a single waiting list. But then, of course, what happened was white flight to the suburbs, and the waiting list for Boston public housing became predominantly people of color.
Jessica,
Keep going.
Jessica has
Okay.
stack. Thank you, Georgette.
One of my most basic points is that segregation itself is not the problem. The problem lies back to the founding of this country and before. A refusal to recognize the humanity and value and worth of Black people and people of color, and the notion that to escape these conditions of disadvantage, you have to be near white people. We need to start from a point of equality and not perpetuate the notion that there's something about Black people or Black culture that is inadequate, problematic, or needs to be fixed. You read it all the time. Black neighborhoods are so disadvantaged that we have to tear them up, dismantle them, put people out, get them out of them. That's a problematic narrative. It's been destructive of the notion of Black community. The emphasis on integration feeds the notion of Black deficit, which rewrites the narrative of Black excellence in such a way that we forget the 1850 Boston school desegregation case. How can we change our understanding or conception of who has value and how we show care for that value in our community? Is there more? I lost my place.
Oh, I'll pick up from here. That was the end of the paragraph, Jessica.
Thank you.
In the narrative we tell about Brown, there's a missing clause. In this country, separate but equal is not possible because of racism. Integration is not a path to racial justice. Rather, it is an outcome of racial justice. It can only occur once we have dismantled the structures of inequality. Instead of opening the door, we need to tear down the door and the walls. This is the difference between an American ideology of individual opportunity and the reality of structures of inequality. Brown exists as an aspirational text in that it joins the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as formulations of ideals. The importance of Brown is not legal, it is cultural. It is the articulation of this notion of equality that we have to hold on to and try to make real.
Thank you everyone for reading.